The evening sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as a distinguished-looking man in his 50s walked toward his car. He had just wrapped up another demanding day in court, where he presided over cases ranging from minor disputes to serious felonies. After 20 years on the bench, these days had become routine, yet each one still brought new challenges and stories that reminded him why he chose this path. He had changed out of his judicial robes into comfortable casual wear, a simple polo shirt and khaki pants. Most people passing by would never guess he was one of the city's most respected judges. That's exactly how he liked it. His colleagues often drove luxury cars and lived in gated communities, but he preferred his 10-year-old sedan and the modest house where he'd raised his kids. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty now, with just a few cars belonging to the cleaning staff and security guards. He waved goodbye to Mr. Rodriguez, the elderly security guard who always stayed late to make sure everyone got to their cars safely. They'd shared countless conversations over the years about their families, their dreams for their grandchildren, and their shared love of baseball. As he drove through downtown Atlanta, his mind wandered to the cases he'd heard that day. A young man caught stealing food to feed his siblings. A landlord-tenant dispute that revealed the growing housing crisis in their community. Each case was more than just a file number. It was a story about real people facing real challenges. He stopped at a red light and watched people heading home from work, carrying grocery bags, holding their children's hands, living their everyday lives. This was the city he'd sworn to serve, where he'd grown up watching his own father work 2 jobs to put him through law school. The same streets where he now saw both the struggles and the triumphs of his community. Traffic was lighter than usual as he turned onto the familiar route home. He knew every pothole, every crosswalk, every corner store along this path. Mrs. Chen, who ran the small grocery store on the corner, was just pulling down her shop's shutters. She gave him her usual warm wave. She didn't know he was a judge, just a regular customer who always asked about her family. The radio played softly in the background, a mix of old soul music that reminded him of Sunday afternoons in his grandmother's kitchen. He thought about calling his daughter, who was away at medical school. She'd been stressed about her upcoming exams, and he wanted to share some words of encouragement. Maybe he'd stop by that bookstore she loved and send her a care package. He carefully signaled and changed lanes, following the same careful driving habits he maintained throughout his career. As a judge, he knew all too well how a single moment of carelessness could change lives forever. Just then, he noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser was signaling him to pull over. As he carefully steered his car to the side of the road, he felt a familiar knot in his stomach, one that had nothing to do with being a judge and everything to do with being a black man being pulled over at dusk. He took a deep breath and reached for his license, wondering what was about to unfold on this ordinary evening that suddenly felt anything but routine. As the patrol car's lights flashed behind him, he pulled over smoothly, positioning his car well off the road. His hand stayed visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, just as he taught his own children to do. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach, noticing the stiff posture and hand hovering near the holster, body language he observed countless times in his courtroom. The beam of a flashlight swept through his car windows, bright enough to make him squint. He could now see the officer was young, probably not more than a few years on the force. The judge kept his movements slow and deliberate as he lowered his window, the evening air carrying the scent of nearby pine trees and car exhaust. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp and hostile. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop. The judge noticed the officer's nameplate was partially obscured by his protective vest. The body camera's red light blinked steadily on the officer's chest. "Good evening, officer," the judge replied calmly, his voice steady from years of maintaining composure in tense courtroom situations. "May I reach for my wallet to get my license?" He waited for permission, knowing how crucial these first moments could be. The officer's response came quick and harsh. "Where'd you get this car?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions. The judge felt his stomach tighten, but kept his expression neutral. He'd faced this kind of prejudice before, long before he wore the robes of justice. "This is my car, officer. I've owned it for 10 years now," he replied evenly. "Would you like to see the registration?" His hand remained visible, not moving toward the glove compartment without explicit permission. The car's engine ticked as it cooled in the evening air. More patrol cars were arriving now, their lights painting the street in rotating reds and blues. Neighbors were beginning to peek through their curtains at the growing scene. The judge thought about all the cases he'd heard involving traffic stops gone wrong, about the conversations he'd had with his children about moments exactly like this one. The young officer's radio crackled with chatter, but he kept his flashlight trained on the judge's face. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his other hand still resting on his weapon. The judge knew his rights, knew this order wasn't justified, but he also understood the delicate balance of this moment. "Officer," he began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his courtroom, "I don't believe I've been told why I was stopped. Could you please explain the reason for this traffic stop?" He maintained eye contact through the rearview mirror, watching the officer's expression shift between confusion and anger at being questioned. The tension in the air grew thicker as more officers gathered at the scene. The judge could hear their boots on the pavement, see their shadows stretching across his car in the glow of multiple spotlights. What had started as a routine drive home had turned into something far more significant. A moment that would soon change not just his life, but his entire community's future. The tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. The young officer's demeanor grew increasingly agitated as he realized his usual tactics weren't having their intended effect. The judge remained perfectly still, his hands visible on the steering wheel, his voice steady and calm despite the growing knot in his stomach. "I said, step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his voice rising. The judge could hear the uncertainty creeping in, masked by aggression. He'd seen this pattern countless times in his courtroom. Authority challenged, leading to escalation rather than reason. 2 more patrol cars had arrived, their lights creating a dizzying light show that attracted more onlookers. The neighborhood, usually quiet at this hour, was coming alive with curious faces in windows and people standing on their porches. Some had their phones out, recording everything. The judge took a slow, deep breath. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "But I have the right to know why I've been stopped. I signaled my lane change, I'm well under the speed limit, and my tags are current." The officer's radio crackled again, and a new voice cut through the tension. "Unit 247, what's your status?" The judge recognized the voice. It belonged to a senior officer who testified in his courtroom just last week. While the young officer was distracted by his radio, the judge noticed a small detail that spoke volumes. The officer's hands were shaking slightly. Behind the tough exterior was someone probably not much older than his own son. Someone who might have made assumptions, jumped to conclusions, but was now realizing he might have misread the situation. More backup officers approached, their footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road. One of them whispered something to the primary officer, whose eyes suddenly widened. The judge could read the changing expressions like pages in a book: confusion, disbelief, and then the dawning realization of exactly who was sitting in the car he'd stopped. A warm evening breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the scent of blooming magnolias. It was such a stark contrast to the cold sweat that had formed on the judge's brow. He thought about all the times he'd heard similar stories in his courtroom, about all the cases where things had gone terribly wrong in moments just like this. The body cameras kept recording, their little red lights blinking steadily in the growing darkness. The judge knew that what happened next would matter, not just for him, but for every person who'd ever found themselves in this situation without the protection of a title or position. He watched in the mirror as the senior officer finally arrived on the scene, his face changing from professional concern to shock as he recognized the man behind the wheel. The moment of recognition was about to change everything, but not in the way anyone might have expected. The senior officer's arrival changed the atmosphere instantly, like a sudden break in storm clouds. He walked briskly toward the judge's car, recognition clear on his face. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and concern. The young officer's posture stiffened, his face draining of color as the words registered. "Evening, Lieutenant," the judge replied calmly, still keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, their phones recording every moment of this unexpected scene. Some were live streaming, ensuring this incident wouldn't stay contained to their quiet neighborhood. The senior officer turned to the young officer, speaking in low but firm tones. The judge could read the body language, the slight slouch of shoulders, the nervous shifting of feet. The young officer's earlier bravado had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. One by one, the backup units began to leave, their lights clicking off, returning the street to its normal evening dimness. The judge watched through his mirror as the young officer was pulled aside for what appeared to be an intense conversation. He could almost feel the weight of realization crushing down on the young man's shoulders. The senior officer approached the judge's window again, his manner completely transformed from the usual confidence he showed in court. "I apologize for this situation, Your Honor," he said, genuine regret in his voice. "Please feel free to go. We'll handle this internally." But the judge didn't start his car. Instead, he finally turned off the engine he'd left running throughout the entire encounter. The click seemed to echo in the now quiet street. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying the same authority it did from the bench, "I'd like to speak with the officer who stopped me." The crowd of neighbors had thinned, but those remaining watched intently as the young officer approached the car again, this time with a completely different demeanor. His earlier aggression had been replaced by visible shame and fear. The body camera kept recording, capturing every moment of what was about to become a turning point in both their lives. The judge looked at the young officer, really looked at him, saw past the uniform to the person wearing it. He saw someone who'd made a mistake, yes, but also someone who might be capable of learning from it. In that moment, he made a decision that would reshape not just this officer's future, but potentially the entire department's approach to community policing. The streetlights had fully come on now, casting pools of yellow light on the scene. Moths danced around the beams as the judge prepared to say words that would transform this moment from a potential tragedy into something unexpectedly powerful. The night air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The judge stepped out of his car, his movements slow and deliberate. The young officer took an instinctive step back, his earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. In the soft glow of the streetlights, the contrast between them was striking. One in a casual polo shirt and slacks, the other in full uniform, yet somehow looking smaller by the minute. "What's your name, son?" the judge asked, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used when mentoring young lawyers. The officer's reply came out barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed on the ground. The judge noticed how young he really was, probably fresh out of the academy, maybe even a rookie on his first solo patrol. The senior officer stood nearby, watching the interaction with a mix of concern and curiosity. The few remaining neighbors had fallen silent, sensing they were witnessing something important. The chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic were the only sounds breaking the evening quiet. "Look at me," the judge said, not unkindly. When the young officer raised his eyes, he saw not anger or threat of punishment, but something unexpected: understanding. The judge had seen that look of fear before in his courtroom, when people realized their actions had led them to a crossroads. "I want you to understand something," the judge continued, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Tonight could have gone very differently. I could have been a doctor heading to an emergency, a father rushing to his child's school, or just another citizen driving home. The uniform you wear and the badge you carry come with power, but they also come with responsibility. The body cameras kept recording as the judge shared brief stories from his early days as a lawyer, times when he'd faced similar prejudices. He talked about his own son's first traffic stop, about the talks every parent in their community had to have with their children about staying alive during police encounters. The young officer's face changed as he listened, from fear to shame, then to something deeper, recognition. The senior officer moved closer, nodding slightly as the judge's words resonated with his own experiences. The night air seemed to carry the weight of decades of similar encounters, but also the possibility of change. As the judge spoke, a small group of other officers had gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the unusual scene of a traffic stop turned into an impromptu lesson in humanity. Their radios crackled softly, but no one moved to answer. This was a moment that demanded their full attention. The next morning, the story had already spread like wildfire through social media. Cell phone videos from neighbors showed different angles of the encounter, and local news stations were running the story on their morning broadcasts. The police department's internal affairs office was flooded with calls, while community leaders demanded a formal investigation. The young officer sat nervously in the precinct's break room, watching his face appear on the morning news. His colleagues walked past with mixed expressions, some sympathetic, others disappointed. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, untouched since he poured it an hour ago. Meanwhile, the judge sat in his chambers, his phone buzzing constantly with messages and calls. Reporters wanted statements, activists wanted him to press charges, and his fellow judges wanted to know how he was handling the situation. But his mind was elsewhere, focused on an idea that had kept him awake most of the night. The body camera footage had been reviewed by department higher-ups. It showed everything: the baseless stop, the escalation, and most importantly, the conversation that followed. What caught everyone's attention wasn't the confrontation, but the way it ended, not with anger or accusations, but with a dialogue that opened eyes and changed perspectives. The police chief called an emergency meeting. The conference room filled with department heads, community leaders, and civil rights representatives. They expected demands for the officer's badge, calls for lawsuits, and public apologies. Instead, the judge walked in with a different proposal. He spread some papers on the table, a rough outline for a new training program. Not just another mandatory diversity seminar, but something different. Something that would pair officers with community members, judges, and civil rights lawyers for real conversations about their experiences, fears, and hopes. The young officer was called into the meeting. His hands shook as he entered the room full of senior officials. But when the judge stood up and asked him to share his thoughts about what happened, something unexpected happened. The officer spoke from his heart about his own biases, his fears, and what he'd learned from that encounter. As the meeting progressed, the tension in the room slowly transformed into something else: hope. The chief listened intently as the judge and the young officer together described how a moment of potential conflict had become an opportunity for understanding. Outside, reporters waited for news of punishments or resignations, unaware that inside, something far more powerful was taking shape. In the weeks that followed, the police department's training room transformed into something unusual. The judge sat at one end of a long table, while officers, both veterans and rookies, filled the seats. The young officer from that night was there too, but not as a trainee. He stood at the front, sharing his story. The program they created wasn't like typical sensitivity training. Real people from the community came to speak: business owners, teachers, teenagers, and parents. They shared their experiences, their fears, and their hopes for better relationships with law enforcement. The officers listened, not just because they had to, but because these stories touched something deep within them. The judge watched as the young officer who'd stopped him grew into an unexpected leader. His honest account of that night, his assumptions, his fears, and what he learned, resonated with his fellow officers in a way no textbook or formal training ever could. The body camera footage became a powerful teaching tool, showing how situations could be handled differently. Community members who'd been skeptical at first began to see changes. Officers were stopping to chat with store owners, playing basketball with kids in the park, and most importantly, approaching traffic stops differently. The us versus them mentality was slowly starting to crack. The local news, which had initially chased the controversy, now found themselves covering a different kind of story. They filmed training sessions where officers and community members sat together, sharing meals and conversations. The cameras captured moments of genuine connection. A veteran officer tearing up as he listened to a mother's fears for her children. A teenage boy teaching a rookie officer his favorite handshake. The young officer worked closely with the judge to refine the program. Together, they created scenarios based on real experiences, helping officers recognize their own biases and teaching them practical ways to handle tense situations. What started as a potential career-ending mistake had become a catalyst for real change. Other police departments began sending observers to learn about the program. The judge's inbox filled with requests from cities across the country, all wanting to know how they could implement similar changes. The young officer found himself speaking at police academies, his story serving as both a warning and a message of hope. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, the training room buzzed with energy as police officers from across the state gathered for a special session. The judge stood at the podium, but today was different. He wasn't here to teach, but to celebrate what they'd achieved. Statistics flashed across the screen behind him. Traffic stop complaints down by 60%, improved community satisfaction ratings, and most importantly, stronger relationships between officers and residents. But numbers couldn't capture the real changes happening on the streets. The young officer, now promoted to training coordinator, shared stories from recent graduates of their program. One officer had helped organize a community basketball league. Another started a mentoring program for teenagers interested in law enforcement. These weren't just feel-good stories. They were signs of real cultural change. Local businesses had noticed the difference too. The coffee shop owner who used to watch officers with suspicion now kept their favorite orders ready. Kids who once ran from patrol cars now waved hello. Even routine traffic stops had transformed from moments of tension into opportunities for positive interaction. The judge walked through the training facility's halls, now lined with photos of successful community events. He paused at one that showed the young officer playing chess with a group of elderly residents in the park. The same officer who'd once approached his car with such hostility was now one of the most respected community liaisons on the force. During breaks, officers shared their own transformation stories. A veteran admitted how the program helped him recognize biases he didn't know he carried. A rookie described how the training gave her tools to build trust in her assigned neighborhood. Their honesty created a ripple effect, encouraging others to examine their own attitudes and behaviors. The city council had taken notice too. They'd increased funding for community policing initiatives and approved plans to expand the program. Other cities sent representatives to learn how they could implement similar changes in their departments. What started as a tense traffic stop was becoming a model for police reform nationwide. 2 years after the traffic stop, the judge pulled into that same spot where everything had changed. The street looked different now. Community gardens had sprung up, children played freely, and patrol cars drove by with windows down, officers waving to residents they knew by name. He was meeting the young officer here for a special reason. They'd been invited to speak at a national police reform conference, sharing how a potentially disastrous encounter had sparked real change. As they stood there, an elderly woman approached them with fresh cookies, the same neighbor who'd recorded the original incident on her phone. The police academy had completely revamped its training program. New recruits now spent time in the communities they'd served before ever putting on a uniform. They learned local history, met community leaders, and understood the neighborhoods as more than just patrol zones. The young officer led many of these sessions, his story becoming a powerful lesson in humility and growth. The judge still drove his same modest car, but traffic stops in the city had taken on a different tone. Officers approached vehicles with respect rather than suspicion. They learned to look for opportunities to connect rather than confront. The department's new motto, inspired by that night: read, protect, serve, understand. That evening, they visited the local community center where a graduation ceremony was taking place. A new class of officers was completing the enhanced training program. In the audience sat community members who'd helped shape their education, shop owners, teachers, parents, and kids who'd shared their stories and perspectives. The young officer, standing at the podium, looked different from that nervous rookie of 2 years ago. His voice carried confidence as he addressed the graduates, but it was the gentle kind that comes from understanding rather than authority. He shared his story one more time, but now it wasn't just about a mistake. It was about the power of second chances and the possibility of real change. As the judge watched from his seat, he thought about how many lives had been touched by what happened that night. News crews still occasionally called for updates, but the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the daily interactions, the small moments of trust being built, the gradual healing of old wounds. The sun set over the city, painting the sky in warm colors. Outside the community center, new officers chatted with residents, sharing stories and laughs. The judge and the young officers stood together, watching the scene unfold. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments: a traffic stop, a conversation, a decision to learn rather than judge.